say goodbye to BSP because the new modeling tools are in beta for Unreal Engine 5. The new modeling toolset lets you create shapes, polymodel, sculpt, and build procedural content directly in the editor. It's always been a rather tedious part of the pipeline to go back and forth between your modeling package and the engine, especially when that work is for blocking out assets that require the context of a playable character. So our new modeling tools aim to alleviate this issue by letting you create static mesh assets directly in the editor. I'm Aaron Langmead, technical artist and evangelist for Epic Games, and in today's talk we're going to block out a scene and build placeholder assets for this environment. This will demonstrate how these tools work and how you can integrate this process into your pipeline. To be clear, we're not going to build a finished environment today. Our modeling tools are still experimental, and at this time we recommend focusing on using the tools for blockout only. The environment we're going to build is based on a concept piece by David Hons for the Shogunite Challenge on ArtStation. Thanks to him for letting me use his concept piece. So with that and a puref of reference work, we can start building our scene. Although we do need to do just one quick thing inside our plugins folder. We need to make sure that we've got our modeling tools editor mode and static mesh editor modeling mode enabled. And we also need to make sure that we've got the geometry script plugin enabled as well. Once we've got all those enabled, we can restart the editor and then we're ready to start building. As a reference point, this is the target scene that we're going to be finishing with. And we're going to do as much of this as possible in the next 30 odd minutes or so. This is the scene that I'm going to be starting with. As you can see, I've got a bit of a lighting setup. I have my landscape already sculpted in, and I've got a few reference points dotted around here just so I can rebuild this scene a little bit more quickly. I've also got a character reference and the water. So the modeling tools that we're going to be working with have already been enabled. We can access them either by holding down Shift and 5, or we can go from the drop-down menu to select our mode and choose modeling. So let's dive right in and start building this scene. I'm going to start off just with the buildings, and then we'll move on to some of the boardwalk and create some modular pieces. So to start with, we need to create some geometry for this scene. Now we could use the shapes tool, which is going to give us options for a few different primitive types, much like any of the modeling tools that are available out there. But for this, I'm actually going to use polyextrude, which is a really nice way of just drawing out a polygonal shape and then pulling it up. I've got this set to rectangle under draw mode, and there are a range of other options that allow you to create different shapes. And I'm going to click and just draw out the rectangle shape. That's looking pretty good. We might do a little bit of edits to that later, but that's going to give us a nice base to work with. And then when we want to modify that shape, we are going to use the poly edit mode. And that is much like the normal kind of tool modeling. There's much like the normal edit mode that you see in things like Blender or 3ds Max. It's got all of the different functions that you'd want to use. So extrude, bevel, inset. And what we want to do is we just want to add an edge loop to the middle of this so I can pull up to make my roof. So I'm going to accept that, click on the single edge at the middle, and then just pull up to create my roof shape. Now this has created a static mesh inside the content browser, so I could drag this out and use it in my scene. But for this building, I actually want to create a prefab. So to do that, I'm just going to quickly rename this building base. And then I'm going to right click on this mesh in the scene, go to level and create packed level actor. And what that will do is it will ask me to select where I want my pivot to be. I'm just going to leave that as default. And then I'm going to go to my packed level blueprint folder, and I'm going to call this demo building, just to keep my naming conventions easy. And then it's going to ask me to create a blueprint, which is going to be the actual prefab that we're using. And you can see I've got two here as a quick demo. So I'm just going to prefix this with BPP _ demo building and save that as well. Now this will convert this mesh into a packed blueprint. So you can see in here, this is now referencing the blueprint that it's made and the level that we're using within that. And what that means is we can start dropping things into this level, and that will update this blueprint and thereby update all of the actors within here. Now I've got a few extra packed blueprints that are just referencing this cube. So I'm just going to go through, select all of them, and I'm going to replace them with that building that we've just made. And that's going to give me a nice base to start working with for this environment. Now we've got some base buildings in, but I want to add something that's got a little bit more detail. So let's build up the docks around these buildings. Now I could go in and I could drop down a load of boxes and scale them to create my wooden planks, but I'm quite lazy. So instead I'm using some blueprints with geometry script. Now, geometry script is incredibly powerful. It's taking all of the modeling modes that we have here, so our ability to create shapes and make edits to them, and it exposes it to blueprint so we can build interesting shapes using our blueprint tools. Now, we will get into this feature in more detail later on, but the basics of this are we're going to loop through a certain number of times, and we're going to append a box with a custom transform to go through and create a bunch of different planks. So this is the end result that we have here. And we can make some minor adjustments to our scale if we want, just to kind of tweak it. I've got some random rotation control as well, which we can put in there, and some spawn chancing as well. So it kind of randomizes whether it spawns or not. Now, what we want to do is go in, and I'm going to just have these placed for me. And I'm going to place up to kind of like a rough square for that. And I'm going to just increase my spacing just a little bit. Then let's duplicate it out, and we want to create the support beams for that. So I'm just going to drop that down to 3 assets and space that out, scale these up a little bit. And that's going to be my kind of base template for these. Now, once we're happy with those, we just need to save them out as an asset file. So to do that, I've created an exposed function called save mesh, which is going to take that mesh, save it to my content folder. And I'm going to just call this sm_boards and press save. And then I'm going to do the same for this one and save that as well. Now, I obviously don't want to have 2 separate meshes for this. So to get around that, we're going to take these 2 meshes and we're going to combine them together. And then once I've placed these meshes in the scene, I can go to my modeling mode and I can do a mesh merge. Now, mesh merge will take all of the meshes that we have selected and combine them into a single asset. And we can choose to write this to a new object, to the first input object, or the last. So I'm going to tell it to overwrite SM boards and then press accept. Now in my content browser, you can see I've got my new asset, which has the boards combined into one single asset. So I'm going to just delete that old one and I'm going to drop this in, and we're actually going to put this straight into the splines that I've got for the boardwalk, and we can make some edits to it afterwards so that we can see those updates. So I'm just going to go to my static mesh and press SM boards. That's going to put that in the scene for me. Now at the moment they're rotated around the wrong way and they're also facing the wrong direction. So let's just quickly fix that on our base asset. So we're going to just go through and rotate this around. And then I'm going to rotate it around so it's facing this way. And then I'm going to press my bake RS. And what that will do is it will reset my scale and it will reset my rotation, but keep the asset in its original position. And we're going to add just a few extra meshes to this just to add a little bit of extra detail. So I'm going to go to my basic shapes and I'm going to add a cylinder. And that's going to do for now. I'm just going to scale that up a little bit. I want this to go down quite deep to cover the range of water levels. Bring this closer to the original boards and then put it roughly in the middle between these 2 points. Then let's duplicate this out, rotate it round, move it to about the halfway point between the original beam. Now I'm going to just do this one side, but I will eventually need to make one that covers both sides. And just to finish this off, I'm going to add a little joiner that's going to let me do that. So just reset these down, add a little box, and then I'm going to just scale this again. Now remember, every time we do standard scaling, we do need to make sure that we're fixing our transform. Otherwise, it can create some issues later on when we start performing other operations on it. So something like that will be fine for now. And then let's add a shunt that's going to lock that piece of wood into place. Something like that will do. And then we're just going to do a quick poly edit, select those edges, and I'm just going to scale that in slightly to create a bit of a point and move that over. There we go. Now I'm just going to copy that over to the opposite side. That will absolutely do for now. And once we have done that, we can select all of these assets, and I'm going to just set this to be a combined mesh. So again, we're going to mesh merge. We are going to select the last output, which is our SM boards, and we're going to press accept. Now that looks quite good, but we have a slight issue, which is that our material is no longer applied because we have 2 slots here. So to fix that, I'm just going to go to the material editor, and we're just going to set 1 material for this. And then we're going to make sure that we select all, and we're just going to assign the active material. And then once we accept that, it's going to set it back to a single material slot. Now we've done the pier, let's move on to fleshing out the building a bit more. To do this, I'm going to work inside the actual level actor that we've created for our prefab. So I'm just going to double click on that. And let's use a little bit of video editing magic to add lights so we can see what we're doing. So we've got our base building. What we need to do now is create a bunch of modular pieces that we can use to make this building look a bit more complete and ready to swap out with its final assets. To do that, I'm going to use the plank spawn blueprint that I've already used. And as we've already covered that, I'm going to just drop the asset in rather than make you watch me build another set of planks again. So I'm just going to drop this into the scene. And rather than make you watch as I copy these, I'm just going to use a bit more video editing magic, like so. Now, one of the really useful things about working in the editor like this is that we can really easily adjust pre-existing models that we've made to make new assets. So what I'm going to do now is create a triangle section that's going to fit this top corner of the roof. So to do that, I'm going to duplicate these 2 pieces up, and I'm going to do a mesh merge on these assets. So we're going to do a new object from this, and we're going to call this SM_building try. Okay, and we're going to accept that. And this has now created a new asset inside our content browser called SM_building try. And now what I want to do is Boolean out this original shape. So to do that, I'm going to select this thing here, and I'm just going to make sure it's intersecting nicely. And then I am going to select this shape, and I'm just going to do mesh bool. And what we want to do is we want to do the intersection of this shape, and we're going to just accept that. Don't worry about losing the building, we don't really need it anymore. And lastly, I'm just going to add a box in and make sure that we're not aligning our normal. I'm just going to make sure this gets put in around the center line. Then we can just do a quick edit on that shape. Expand that out, and we'll do another Boolean. Okay. Now we've got our finished triangle, we can duplicate it round, and we can pop it on the other side of our building. Like so. Now we can use this to create loads of other different shapes. For instance, we could swap out this piece with a door piece, and we could put another door in over here. And we could even make some more damaged paneling and use that instead. Let's select a few of these and just replace with some damaged paneling. Like so. Last thing we need to do is add a beam. So I'm just going to place a dynamic box here, scale it up to about the right size. Make sure it's got that wood panel on it. And then I can promote that to an asset. So now we have our beam, we can place those in either corner and we can add it to the edging. I think that'll do. Let's see how that looks in our original scene. So we're back in our scene and you can see that nothing's changed just yet. And that's because when we use packed blueprints, we need to make sure that we tell it to update. So we're just going to go to level, update packed blueprint. And there's our updated prefab that's now copied across this entire level. So the last thing that this building needs now is a roof. So let's make one using the new sculpting tools. To do this, I'm going to go back into our prefab and I'm going to build a new asset using the modeling tools based on a box. And I'm just going to place that into the world. Go to my poly deform and we're just going to drag out this shape just a little bit until we get something that we can work with. A little bit long, like that. I'm going to rotate that along there. And then I'm just going to pull that in ever so slightly. That will do. Next, we need to get some more definition to this shape before we can start sculpting on it. So to do that, I'm going to vox wrap it. And I'm going to keep that quite low. And what that will do is it will apply a voxelization process, giving us nice, even topology on this surface. Right, with that done, we are going to now increase the subdivision because we've got these nice kind of soft edges on the surface. So I'm going to apply a subdivision and press accept. And that's going to give us a lot more geometry to play with when we're sculpting. And then I am going to go to our sculpting tab and start adding a little bit of sculpt information onto this. So again, the sculpting tools are still very early on, so we're not aiming to do any incredible sculpt work here. All we want to do is add just a little bit of sculptural information so we get a general indication of the form. I'm just going to smooth out some of that detailing that we've just put in. And quite honestly, that's going to be absolutely fine for what we need because our next step is going to scatter some information along this surface. So we've made our shape. All we need to do is make sure that we name it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use another geometry script blueprint that I've made to add some extra definition and information to this surface. So I'm going to drop a blueprint called first spawn into our surface. And where it says original mesh, I am going to put our thatch that we've just sculpted. And then under spawn, I'm going to put a pre-made grass clump on top of that. So that's going to spawn these meshes along this asset. And I'm going to knock that up to 50 just to start with. And then we just want to push that in a particular direction. So I'm going to set that to 3. I have got a material that I've already made for this, which I'm going to use. And we're going to drastically increase this. But first, I want to just name the output asset. And in this instance, I just want to overwrite the original one that we've got. So I'm going to call this sm_thatch. So when I save this mesh out, that's going to overwrite the original. So I'm going to set this up to about 250. And then I'm going to press save. And that will now overwrite the original mesh. Okay, so that's our updated mesh. We can just add a few instances of that along our surface. Again, make sure that's coming right up to the edges of what we're working on. Like so. And then I'm just going to duplicate that and push it on the other side. Now, if we go back into our original scene, and right click on our building, level, update pack blueprint and save. Now I've added some detail to the docks and the buildings. Let's decorate the landscape. Now to do this, I'm going to use the sculpting tools and create a number of meshes that I can overlay on top of the landscape to create more interesting shapes and geometry. So to start with, I'm just going to create a sphere and drop that into the scene. And then I'm going to increase the radius in the X and Y till I have a nice big plate that I can work on. I'm just going to zero out my rotation as well. And then I'm going to reset my rotation and scale. And I'm going to vox wrap this at a reasonably high resolution. That's going to give me a lot of geometry to play with. Then I'm going to go to my sculpting mode and move to grab. And I'm just going to scale up the size of this because I want to do some fairly big pushes. And what I want to do here is just create a little bit of interesting shape variation on this surface that I can use to kind of sculpt up a bit more later. Then I'm going to use the inflate brush just to add a little bit of height variation, especially around the edges, and then just soften that a little bit with the shift key to smooth it. And then once I've got something that's reasonably interesting, I'm going to use the displace button to add some noise to this surface. Now I want to start off with some quite soft noise. And I want to really lower the number of subdivisions because we're going to be applying this a few times. And this is a bit easier to manage if you add this scale in layers. So something like that, and just drop that down a bit. Then we can add another layer back in and drop that down like so. Then back into my sculpting tools, I can add a little bit more information. So now when I inflate, I'm going to get this nice kind of ridged, raised surface on here. Now I'm going to start getting some issues with my mesh if we have a look over here. So to fix that, I'm just going to apply a new vox wrap on that surface and then accept that. So for this, what I'm trying to do is create kind of a bit of a mossy ground, maybe a kind of like a rougher dirt effect as well. So just to finish this off, I'm going to apply just one more displace modifier to it, just to kind of give me some really interesting shapes to kind of work with. Like so. And that's going to pretty much do it for this. So I'm just going to scale this down a little bit because I don't want it to be too intense. And then also I just need to make sure that my pivot is going to be in the correct place. So I'm just going to tweak my pivot so it's a little bit higher on this surface. And I'm also going to bake my rotation and scale back down again. And this is going to serve as a really nice plate for me to start scattering on top of this landscape. So to do that, I just need to promote this to an asset in our foliage mode. So I'm just going to open this up. And then I'm going to drag it straight into the foliage type section. And this is going to prompt me to make a new foliage type asset. So I'm just going to go in here, rename my prefix to FT and press OK. And now I can start painting these down on the surface. So now I just need to tweak a few of the settings. So increase my radius, which is going to stop them from being spawned right on top of one another. And I also want to do average normal, which is going to give me slightly better angling on the surface. You can see there already we've got some much more interesting shapes. And this is still a little bit too high as well. So what I'm going to do is just go back into my original shape that we've got here. And I'm just going to adjust the pivot once more just to see if I can get this a little bit lower down. So if we just up it to something like this maybe. See how that looks. Now we're getting some nice intersections with the base landscape, which is what we really want. We don't want this to be poking out too much from the base surface. We just want to get some nice surface detail and variation there. Now I can always go back in and tweak this later, but for now that's going to be fine. So I can start painting this down. We can even add some scale variation as well. So if I do something like that, we can repaint this down and get some nice interesting geometry there. And I also have quite a nice shader effect that I can put on this, which is going to blend this into the landscape just a little bit more nicely. So if I just search for my plate, I've got a landscape plate material. So applying that material is going to start blending this in with the landscape a bit better. So we have a slightly softer surface that we're working with here. And just to give you a few more examples, I've made a few extra types of this mesh type that I can show you. And I'm just going to add those into our foliage type. So let's take my pebbles, sand, underwater, and dirt, and just drop those in. So these ones are all made again in the engine and just show off some of the different features that you could do. So we can do a sand effect, just like so. And if we go over to here, I've actually got a bit of beach area ready to be populated with some sand effect. And you can kind of go into some of these edges, start painting some of this down. Again, if we're finding that we're getting a lot of these kind of areas where it's kind of poking out a little bit, that's mainly because we're just working with such large plates. So we can actually scale these down or make smaller versions of them and use those instead. That would create a much better effect. And I've got another one, which is, again, all made in the engine. So this one has some nice kind of pebble detail to kind of add a little bit more information. So we can put that down in a few different places as well. And finally, I've got some kind of corally rock build-up, which I've put in as well. So I can add this to a load of the edges here to kind of create some nice corally build-up. We can obviously go in and we can tweak these a little bit more. If we want these to kind of blend a little bit better, we can increase the strength of that shader effect. And that's going to give us a really nice kind of finish to the landscape when we start populating it. Now we've decorated our landscape, it's time to add a little bit of foliage. And with foliage, it seems like a great opportunity to discuss the geometry script tools that are in the editor. I've created two examples here to show you how the geometry script tools work, a grass card generator and a tree generator. Now, both of these classes extend from the blueprint generated dynamic mesh actor. So whenever you want to create a geometry script, you just need to use this blueprint class as the base. When you create a blueprint of this class, you get an event called onRebuildGenerated_Mesh. That includes the dynamic mesh component built as a standard. That has the output for this dynamic mesh, and you'll see that it's in the event graph rather than construction. And while this does generally have the same attributes as the construction script, it's a bit more optimized for the kind of things that we're going to be doing to it. So this, as I said, this is the target mesh, which is what we're applying to, which is this actor here. And that is going to be our final asset in the scene. So whenever we make modifications to that, we do that through the target mesh. Now, to give you an overview of this blueprint, this is the grass card generator. And I'll just show you how this works first. So we have a bunch of default settings, so we can control how closely these things spawn together, we can control how many they spawn, and we can control our scale range for each of those grass cards. And then we also have a kind of blade generator as well, which allows us to control the general parameters for these blades. We can control how many variations we make of these grass cards. We control the width, and we control things like height, twist, and bend. So we start off with a for loop, which lets us control our variation count. And we then allocate a compute mesh for each different variation that we're trying to generate. So this is going to allow us to create a unique piece of geometry that we can then append to the final target once we're ready. I add this to an array of submeshes. And then I create the base shape that I'm going to be using for this. So whenever we want to add a shape, we just need to type in append, and then we get all of the primitives that we can choose to add to this base shape. I'm starting with a basic rectangle, and then we can apply the modifications we want to that to create our bespoke shape. Now you'll notice that we have a target mesh in and a target mesh out. That allows us to daisy chain all of these effects so they can be processed one after the other nice and cleanly. And when we create each of these options, you'll see we have a number of different parameters that we can set to give me a nice organic final look. Once I've got the number of submeshes created, I can start adding them randomly to my final target mesh. And I do this here. I have a defined spawn count, which I loop through, and then I append a random submesh into the final count with a randomized transform to get my location. And the last thing which you need to make sure you do is just once you're finished, release all compute meshes just to finish the final action. And that gives us a nice, highly controllable and customizable grass spawner that we can use on our project. So there are two main ways that we can convert this out to a static mesh. The first is using the modeling mode. So if I go to my demo meshes folder and then just press convert static mesh, that will take this asset and convert it over to a static mesh inside my content browser. However, this generally removes the original asset. So if we don't want to lose that, we can also do this inside Blueprint and expose it to a function. I have an example of this here in the tree tool. All we need to do is get our dynamic mesh and we retrieve that here. And then we create a new static mesh asset from the mesh. To get my location, I have an arbitrary string, which I can enter to name the asset. And to get the path, I just retrieve the current path for my content browser. Then I have a bunch of properties here. I haven't exposed any of these, but you can do that to increase the functionality of this. And then we finally just make sure we have our material set to the same one that we have before. Once we've built this function, we just need to enable call in editor, and that will give us a button that we can use to save that mesh out. You can see we've got our name here. So if I press save mesh, that will then save this asset out. So I can then reuse it in a number of different areas. What's nice about this, again, is that if we keep the original blueprint, we can carry on updating this over time. And as long as we've got our name the same, it will overwrite the original. So if we make a bit of a change to this one, let's add a little bit more wiggle to it. Let's add a little bit more random variation and then press save mesh. You can see that that has now updated on the original source asset. But again, if we leave this in, just press save again, you can see that updates on the original. So once we've generated our foliage assets, we can do the same as we did with our landscape cards, and we can start spawning these in the world. Again, I've created a few base examples here. So I'll just drag those in and we can start just placing those in the world. And again, we can place that in a few places. And I even have some placeholder reeds that we can place into the scene. And I'm afraid that's all I have time for. But as you can see, in a very short period of time, we've gone from a near empty environment to a fully blocked out scene with a folder of placeholder assets ready for artists to convert to finished pieces. This video only scratches the surface of the modeling tools in Unreal Engine 5, but hopefully it will be enough to get you started building your own environments. Keep in mind that these tools are still experimental, so there are a lot more features to come. If you want to learn more, I recommend checking out Ryan Schmidt's YouTube channel. He's one of the engineers working on the geometry tools and has posted a number of videos showing how to use the geometry scripting tools. Thanks for watching, and if you want to reach out or have a chat about any of the new geometry tools, you can find me on Twitter @Aaron Langmead.